free to interject. I'll be happy to respond and discuss. So we're going to be exploring a bit of the background of Hasidism in general, and specifically Chabad Hasidism, and also the historical context of where it came out from. I'm going to start with a video to give us an introduction and background about the time period. I'm going to start slightly in the middle of the video. The beginning describes how in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, the Jewish people, the Jewish communities all over Europe were suffering greatly from massacres, blood libels, different pogroms. There were a lot of anti-Jewish attacks, and life was really chaotic and dangerous for the Jewish people. They were expelled from England, they were expelled from France, and they really didn't know of any peace and any rest. And at the time, the King of Poland invited the Jewish people. He was establishing a new kingdom in Poland, and he wanted the Jews to come and help boost and develop the economy. So he gave them different incentives, tax breaks, etc., to encourage them to move to Poland, which they did. So together with the incentives that they were being given, plus the fact that they weren't being very welcomed, it was hostile territory, the places that they were originally living. Many Jews ended up going eastward to Poland, and really they settled there. It was a beautiful time. They were able to flourish, prosper, do business, settle themselves down. They were also able to establish proper communities and educational systems, and spiritually they were really able to blossom and develop themselves as well. And there was a great deal of Torah scholarship that came about during that time in Poland. So having given that introduction, I'm now going to show the video to take us further along in the history.
In the 16th century, the Szlachta, the Polish nobility, puts the Jews to work in many Jews to work in a very special enterprise. They conquer the Ukraine and take over all kinds of very large estates. And Jews are appointed to run the estates for the Szlachta. Now, the Ukraine, as opposed to the rest of Poland, is not Catholic. The Ukraine is Greek Orthodox. The Ukrainians see the Poles as not only as overlords and as oppressors who squeeze them for money, they also see them as heretics.
In 1648, a savage man by the name of Bogdan Chmelnytsky led the Ukrainian Cossacks in an uprising against the ruling Polish nobility in a bid for independence. Chmelnytsky diverted much of his war effort to a genocidal purge of the region's Jews. As agents of the Polish nobility, the Jews collected the taxes that the non-Jewish residents owed to the Polish landlords. This had provided many Jews with financial security, but it now resulted in great suffering.
The Jewish community suffers tremendous damage. Leadership is wiped out, communities are laid low, Jews are murdered wholesale, and the Jewish community is dealt a blow from which it never will recover.
The survivors suffered exceptional trauma. Families struggled to earn a livelihood, and only a minority could afford their children a Torah education. Soon, a social rift emerged between the few scholars and the overwhelming majority of largely ignorant, impoverished Jews. This fissure only served to deepen the national trauma. Into this group, there stepped a man bearing tidings of salvation. It happened in 1665.
there appeared in the city of Smyrna in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire at the time, a man named Shabtai Tzvi, a greatly charismatic, learned individual who declared himself to be the Messiah. He started a movement which spread like wildfire. There's a famous Jewish woman whose name was Glickel of Hamel, which is in Germany. She describes how her father packed his bags, sold his business, sat there waiting with his packed bags, waiting for the Messiah to reveal himself. The word came to Poland, and none other than Rabbi David Halevi, who was known to in rabbinic circles as the author of one of the major commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, sent his son and someone else to go check out Shabtai Tzvi to see if it's possible that this is really the real thing. There were people who objected. There were people who warned, especially there was a rabbi in Amsterdam, whose name was Rabbi Sportas, who screamed and yelled that this guy's a fraud, but nobody wanted to listen to him.
Reasons for concern rapidly mounted as Shabtai grew increasingly erratic. His devotees attributed this to a superior state, but others recognized that he was mentally unstable. Modern scholars believe that he suffered from bipolar disorder. He introduced blatant violations of Torah law. Since the Messiah has arrived, he explained, matters previously forbidden are now permitted. One man who was particularly unimpressed with Shabtai was the Ottoman ruler Sultan Mehmed IV, who jailed the pseudo-Messiah as a revolutionary in February 1666. 7 months later, the Sultan gave him a choice of Islam or death. Shabtai chose Islam, and Jews worldwide reeled in disbelief.
The intensity of the anticipation that this was the Mashiach was so high that as high as the heights were of anticipation, so were the depths of disappointment among many, many Jews within the world. And the blow was just incalculable.
The Jews of Poland felt doubly abandoned. The new despair dashed their hopes for healing into the blood-soaked reality of post-massacre Poland, compounding hopelessness with suffering and social imbalance with spiritual crisis. A leadership vacuum ensued, and unworthy rabbis took advantage of the chaos and purchased or rented the title rabbi from the local nobles. These rabbis downplayed prayer and sincere spiritual growth. They focused on exhibiting their keen analytic abilities, hoping to become widely known. Pay-to-play rabbis were not the role models and guides the struggling communities required at this fragile time. And by ripping the heart out of the daily prayers, these rabbis tore the soul out of a meaningful dialogue with God, just when the people needed it most. Despite a number of positive developments in Poland, even after 1648, Polish Jewry was in an overall material and spiritual decline. Many God-fearing Torah scholars struggled to survive. Unable and unwilling to bribe their way into rabbinical posts, they could also not rely on their impoverished brethren to hire them as teachers. Rather than fraternize with the unlearned masses, many such scholars embraced asceticism, studying, fasting, and praying in seclusion from their communities. Such individuals, who would normally have served as genuine role models, became unavailable to the community. Moreover, their overly ascetic lifestyles made them melancholic, deepening the national gloom. By the beginning of the 18th century, Jewry was spiritually lethargic, perhaps even comatose. This was the dismal scene into which Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov entered and began to spread his teachings.
So after a prosperous and wonderful golden age in Poland for many, many years, unfortunately, the stability and the freedom was not to last, and the Cossacks came along and decimated communities, and the Jewish people were dealt a really a really harsh blow. And after that, as we saw described in the video, there was an individual named Shabtai Tzvi who declared himself as the Messiah. Many people believed that he could be the Messiah, and this encouraged a wave of fervor and excitement and anticipation. After all the terrible suffering the Jews had been through, they were clinging on to this hope, and that was dashed as well. So they really were in a very bad shape physically and also spiritually. Something needed to change, something needed to happen. They needed new life to be breathed in from somewhere. And along came a rabbi, a Torah scholar, a mystic by the name of Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. And he was actually named Yisrael, Israel, because he was the one who was to awaken the Jewish people from their state of spiritual fainting. When somebody's fainting, you call them by their name. That's one of the things you do to try and draw them back into consciousness. And the Jewish people, known as the people of Israel, he came along, and unlike the scholars of the time who considered themselves elite and held themselves apart from the general masses, he paid attention to Jews of all backgrounds, regardless of how educated or illiterate they were. Many of them had lost the opportunity to become educated because of the poverty and the terrible circumstances of the time. And he really paid attention to them, and he did whatever he could to try and lift them up. He also emphasized joy in the observance of Judaism, which, as we also saw in the video, the general atmosphere was quite depressing and melancholic. And he came along and explained how important it is that to serve God with joy, to do a mitzvah with joy, which again was something that infused the people with renewed spiritual energy and of course also physical energy. Not only did he lift these people up, but he actually taught that the Jewish people, that even the simplest Jew with his simple trust in God has tremendous value and can reach certain places, certain realms in spirituality that even the greatest Torah scholar may not be able to recognize. One of his teachings, one of the sayings, which is shared in his name and is quite famous, is, let's see if I can show it over here. The Alter Rebbe received the following teaching from the Tzaddik Reb Mordechai, who had heard it from the Baal Shem Tov. A soul may descend to this world and live 70 or 80 years in order to do a Jew a material favor and certainly a spiritual one. So he taught the importance of looking out for one's fellow and didn't make any distinction whether it was in physical matters or in spiritual matters, and even said that it could be that your entire mission on earth, all the years of your life, could be just to do a favor materially for your fellow, which shows the emphasis that he placed on Ahavat Yisrael, which means love of a fellow Jew. Now, unfortunately, but perhaps understandably, there was a lot of opposition to these ideas that he brought into the Jewish world. Some of them seemed new. Some of them felt like a threat to the Torah scholars of the day. The Torah scholars felt that they might lose their position in society as respected and above the masses, because the Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov was coming along to say that even a simple person has such tremendous value and has the ability to make a great contribution. Also, after the fiasco with Shabtai Tzvi and everything he tried to introduce, so the established Jewish community, many of the leaders looked very suspiciously at Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, because he taught from ideas based on the Kabbalah, which up until this point were basically kept very limited to scholars of very advanced levels. And now he was bringing that more into the public sphere amongst the people at large. And they were afraid that perhaps he was not a legitimate Jewish leader and could perhaps be similar to somebody like Shabtai Tzvi. This opposition continued for many years. It was passed along to his successor, Rabbi Dover of Mezrich, also faced opposition, and even the leader that followed him, the Alter Rebbe, whom we're going to speak about in a moment, also faced tremendous opposition, to the extent that a libel was brought against him by the Jews who opposed his ideas, and he was actually arrested and imprisoned by the Russian Tsar. After 53 days, the suspicions were cleared and he was released to his followers' great joy. But just to give you an idea of how strongly people opposed these new ideas that they were not accustomed to. So let me show you here a timeline to see how we get from the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, to the Alter Rebbe. So we have the Baal Shem Tov over here, born in 1698. He was orphaned at a young age, and but he was taught and raised by mystics, by those who studied the Kabbalah in secret. He became a very great Torah scholar and a great mystic as well. But he tried to keep that hidden. He didn't want people to know that about him. He wanted to remain unknown and humble and incognito. But his mentors at a certain point began to pressure him, saying that he must come out and reveal himself because he has a very critical role to play for the Jewish people at that point in history. And eventually, in 1734, after he could no longer withstand the pressure, he did reveal himself and begin the founding of the Chassidic movement. As I mentioned, he had a successor, Rabbi Dover, who continued his teachings and spread them even further. And of course, during this time, the followers of the movement were growing. In 1745, Rabbi Schneur Zalman was born, and he was not born into a family. He was born into a family of Hasidim, but he did not know that when he was young. They kept it from him, and as a young man, he on his own, he sought out a new path in service of God, and joined the Chassidic path, and eventually rose as a very great leader. He succeeded Rabbi Dover of Mezrich, and then he went on to found the school of thought known as Chabad Hasidism. Now, just to elaborate a little bit about him. First of all, from a young age, he was a Torah genius. Great scholars of the time who struggled with certain difficult passages in the Talmud for many, many years and were unable to resolve them. He was able to resolve these difficult issues, and he blew the minds of people when he gave them his explanations on them. They did not understand how somebody could have such brilliant and deep insight into Talmudic difficulties and explain them in a way that was so pleasing. But he wasn't only involved in learning and in the service of God. He was very, very deeply committed to helping his brethren. He really cared for them, and he wanted to do whatever was possible to make their lives better. Now, of course, they were still struggling with poverty. Earning a livelihood was never easy, and he felt that if the Jews moved out of the cities and into rural areas and got into farming, they would be able to support themselves a lot better. And he encouraged this initiative. But not only did he encourage it, he actually took his entire dowry, which had been given to him by his father-in-law, and he set it aside to support Jews who would be moving out to work the land. So he really looked out for the Jews of the time, both in a spiritual sense and in a physical sense. Now to talk about the school of thought that he founded, known as Chabad Chassidut. So we said that the Baal Shem Tov, followed by Rabbi Dov Ber Mezrich, introduced Chassidut in general, Hasidism. The Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, developed Hasidism in a new way, known as Chabad Hasidism, which is a more intellectual and thorough ideology of Hasidism. With Hasidism in general, the structure of it tends to be that the leader or the Rebbe who leads the followers is a beacon and a source of inspiration and holiness, and the followers sort of draw from his inspiration and holiness and are carried along by it and thereby lifted up from their material reality. Chabad Chassidut, though, demands something much more. It's much more intellectual. It requires real study and application by the followers. That the followers and the students really learn and invest themselves and apply themselves to improve themselves spiritually, to improve their characters, and not that the ideas shouldn't just remain an inspiration to make them temporarily be lifted up from their reality, but they should actually be able to apply these deep ideas into their day-to-day lives. So what is the Tanya? The Tanya is the fundamental book of Chabad Chassidic philosophy and thought. That's really where Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, outlines in a very methodological and thorough way a system, a method, how to understand the ideas of Chabad philosophy and use them to for self-improvement, for understanding the meaning of life, for fulfilling our purpose in this world. And with this book, the Alter Rebbe wanted to make these ideas accessible to people, all different types of people. So I'm going to show another video here at this point, which is going to elaborate a bit more and hopefully give us a deeper understanding about the book of the Tanya. So let me just share my screen.
The followers of Chabad Lubavitch refer to the book of Tanya as the Bible of Hasidism. It has spawned several thousand editions, was published in myriad locations across the globe, and it is studied daily by thousands of Jews, in private, in classes, online.
This is what the page should look like.
And through apps. Its author, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, was an 18th century scholar and mystic of rare abilities. While our nation produced many great sages over the millennia, Rabbi Shner Zalman stands among the select few that tower over our people's history and power our progress to an inspired destiny. In 1775, he founded the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic movement, and in 1796, he agreed to have his magnum opus, the Tanya, published for public benefit. For 20 years, Rabbi Shner Zalman painstakingly weighed each letter and word of his manuscript, and Jewry has spent the subsequent 200 years unpacking the gifts of guidance he invested within those sacred phrases. In the Tanya, one discovers a highly methodical presentation of the foundational principles of Hasidism: how to serve God sincerely, joyfully, how to remain humble, motivated, how to deal with inner struggles, the purpose of life, of challenge, of existence, of the individual. Insights flow with clarity, forming a cohesive river of wisdom that revolutionized Jewish thought. Surprisingly, the Tanya is not written in the style of a philosophical or theological thesis. Rather, it is framed as a response. Here is the work's purpose as expressed by its author in his foreword to the Tanya. I address those with whom I had frequent warm conversations, and who revealed to me all the secrets of their hearts and minds in all that regard to their heartfelt service of God. This work is comprised of responses to many questions frequently posed by Hasidim in our land, for they seek advice and moral guidance in the service of God, each according to their spiritual station. Time no longer permits me to reply to everyone individually and in detail. Besides, people forget the responses I give them in the course of conversation. I have therefore recorded all the replies to all the questions, to be preserved for perpetuity and to be readily available to all. There is no longer any need for people to press to be admitted to talk with me in private, for in this work, everyone can find counsel to soothe their soul, and proper guidance on any matter that one finds difficult in the service of God. Rabbi Shner Zalman was overwhelmed. He had perfect answers to difficulties that had plagued sincere worshippers since the dawn of time. Who would not wish to meet him and receive life-changing guidance? But a day has only so many hours, while he had tens of thousands of followers who streamed to his door from across Eastern Europe. He therefore set his quill to paper in an effort to do what none had dared to do before: to collect answers to a lifetime of spiritual questions from people of all walks of life. This book would contain, in his words, all the responses to all the questions, and it would be formatted so that it was readily available to all, for all Jews, for all times. The Tanya contains solutions for each individual's struggles in their spiritual and emotional lives, for the Jews of his own times, and for our struggles today.
So that gives us a bigger picture of what the book of the Tanya is, what the Alter Rebbe set out to do by writing the Tanya, and how he wanted it to provide the guidance and the solutions to all the people who would seek it from him. And again, that varied from great scholars to simple people. And this work was intended to be able to address everybody. Now, of course, everybody, different people reading the same book can't necessarily understand it all in the same kind of way. But the Alter Rebbe actually does write in his introduction that those who are scholarly and skilled should not resist helping their fellows if somebody comes to ask for assistance in understanding different ideas in the Tanya, those who are more knowledgeable should not pretend to be humble, but they should step forward and they should help clarify the meaning of what the Alter Rebbe has written in the Tanya. One of the ways in which the Tanya is described is as the written Torah for Hasidism. And even though it's quite a comprehensive work, just like we have the regular written Torah, which has myriads of offshoots and explanations and commentaries going in a chain through the generations, the Tanya as well, the works of Chabad Hasidism from the time of the Alter Rebbe through all the generations of the Chabad leaders that followed him, are culled from this fundamental work, and innovate upon that, expound upon it, and elaborate on it. Before I go into the basic structure of the Tanya, I just want to pause for a moment and ask if there's any questions on what I've said so far, anything that may be unclear, if there's something you'd like to ask. So let's get an idea of the setup of the book itself. Okay, now that we have a basic understanding of the history from where Hasidism rose and the particular significance of the publishing of the Tanya. So I will share my screen once again to make this clearer. So we have the book of the Tanya. Most people refer to it as just simply the Tanya, but it actually does have three names. Okay, so if we start from the first, Likutei Amarim, the Alter Rebbe called it a collection of discourses. Now this is actually because of his great humility. He didn't want to claim that this is a completely original work, so he wanted to point out that it is based on numerous sources from the Torah, from the Mishnah, from Torah scholars like Maimonides, and from a various number of Kabbalists in generations preceding him, such as the Arizal, who was one of the foremost teachers of Kabbalah, the Maharal of Prague, and among others. Now, of course, the way in which he explained and wove together these teachings was original and innovative, but because of his humility, he focused on the fact that he was gleaning this from particular sources. A second name that the book has, Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book of the intermediate. What does it mean, the book of the intermediate? So we know that we can, there's the individual who's the tzaddik, the righteous person who is very spiritual, very holy, is far from sin and very close to God. Then we have an individual known as the rasha, a wicked person who seeks to do evil and pushes away the good. But most of us fall into this category called Sefer Shel Beinonim, the intermediate, the average, regular kind of person. And by calling the book this name, the Alter Rebbe was saying that while some of the ideas in this book may seem challenging, it is within the reach. If you work hard enough and you try hard enough, it is within the reach of each and every individual. So if you look at it and you think this is very demanding, then look at it again and learn it again and see where you can apply it to your life, because there is something that you can take just for you as a regular person who struggles with making the right choices at times, who has different challenges. This is whom the book is for. And the final name, which I've been calling it all along, I apologize for the typo over here, the Tanya. Why is it called Tanya? Simply because the first word of the opening chapter is Tanya. Tanya means, it says in Hebraita. A Braita is a Torah source from the oral Torah, which is basically from the same time period as the Mishnah. And the Alter Rebbe begins the first chapter by quoting a Braita which speaks about how a soul comes down into this world. So just a simple way of referring to the book. It's known by the first name, the first word that is used in the book. Now, the internal structure of the book. So there are actually 5 parts to the Tanya. The first 3, the Alter Rebbe compiled into the book himself. The last 2 were essays and letters that the Alter Rebbe wrote. They weren't originally included in the Tanya, but at a later date, his sons added it to the Tanya and put it all as one compilation together. So part 1, Likutei Amarim, Sefer Shel Beinonim, is 53 chapters. This is the part that we're going to be learning and exploring in the series, which we will be beginning next week. So we're going to get a lot of insight and detail about that. I do want to point out, as I mentioned, the Tanya is known as the written Torah of Chassidut, and as you see, it's 53 chapters long. The written Torah has the Torah that God gave us in Mount Sinai has 53 Torah portions. So there is that parallel in the Tanya, between the Tanya and the written Torah. Part 2 is known as Sha'ar HaYichud VaHa'emunah, the gate or the portal of unity and belief. It discusses God creating the world, God's unity in a world that contains so many different types of creations, and in a world that seems to conceal and hide God. Part 3, so that's 12 chapters. Part 3, Geret HaTeshuvah, is a very detailed explanation, 12 chapters on the idea of repentance, of doing teshuvah, how it works, and the different categories of it. Part 4, Geret HaKodesh, 32 letters that the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman, wrote to his followers over the course of the years. Of course, in those times, communication was not so quick. There were communities of followers in all different places, and he used to write letters and send them out as a way of communicating his instructions or his teachings to his followers for specific times. And then we have part 5, known as Kuntras Acharon, which means the final section or the final pamphlet, and it contains a number of very deep, lofty Kabbalistic essays, which can be quite difficult to understand. So there we have the basic structure of this book. Mostly when people refer to the Tanya, they are referring to the first part, but there's very profound, deep, intriguing ideas in all the different sections. And actually, according to the Chabad custom, which is doesn't remain necessarily limited to Chabad, it's an idea that's spread to many other communities as well. We do learn a portion each day of the year in a specific order, in order to be able to cover all these 5 parts over the course of 1 year. So this just gives us an understanding of the setup or the structure of the book. And as I mentioned before, it's geared towards a regular kind of person, somebody who deals with the forces of good and evil, of a world which is not black and white, and sometimes or often we have to figure out the right way to navigate amongst the gray and the lack of clarity. Originally, when the Alter Rebbe began to share these ideas, he did so orally. He would share Torah thoughts, and he would share these ideas with his students orally, on occasions, on Shabbat, the holidays, at different times. But then at one point and his students would take notes, and they would share these teachings and share them with each other, copy over from one another. Obviously, printing was not so widespread at the time, and what happened was that for copying one handwritten manuscript to another, mistakes came in. Some of them innocent mistakes. Sometimes there were those in the opposition, which we described earlier, who actually took advantage of this to maliciously write manuscripts with mistakes, which would make the ideas of the Alter Rebbe sound not in line with Torah, and even against the Tsarist rulership. So the Alter Rebbe realized that he can no longer just let things go the way they are, but he needs to publish them in an authoritative single book. And that was when he finally worked on writing it all down, which he did over the course of 20 years. And he really carefully calculated and even agonized sometimes over not only the words to include, but even whether to include an individual letter in this work. So every word and sentence and chapter is carefully crafted and carefully chosen to be able to express and relay the important ideas and concepts that he taught. Now, for somebody like the Alter Rebbe, as well as other Kabbalists and mystics, he taught that we have the Torah, we have the Torah law, we have the literal interpretation of the Torah, the story, if you like, and then we obviously have deeper explanations and ideas all the way down to the deepest Kabbalistic secrets of the Torah. Now, there are those who think that Kabbalistic or mystical element of the Torah and of Judaism is a nice additional, they're nice additional teachings which help give the Torah meaning. But in fact, it's actually much more than that. Just like we have a body and a soul, the Torah also has the more material or more literal structure, the more revealed element of it, which is the body of the Torah, the openly exposed part of the Torah. And then you have the deeper dimensions, the Kabbalistic, mystical, Chassidic teachings, which are the soul. And you cannot have one without the other. They need each other to function, and they each contribute to each other and help. We can't understand the Torah fully if we would only have one part of the dimension and not the other. And this is really something that the Alter Rebbe worked to teach and to spread to his followers and to those who learned his teachings. The unity that exists between what seems like the plain, simple text and the very deep meaning of the Torah. The unity that is within the person, even as we have the body, which seems sometimes to be pulled in one direction, and the soul, which seems to be pulled in the other direction, and especially also in the world, where the world stems from God. He created it, it's holy and it's spiritual at its source, but often seems to deny the very one who brought it into being. And he also taught how those things can be united and become cohesive. So after all this talk and description, it can sound like the Tanya is supremely spiritual, and for those of a very lofty caliber who are seeking to separate from their physical lives and serve God and do nothing else. But it's actually interesting to point out that the Tanya has very real, meaningful, emotional, psychological applications. And I just wanted to give you some examples of questions or points or ideas that we can find in the Tanya, which I think will help us realize that it's something that actually does relate to us. So for example, how can I get to know myself more deeply? Why do I sometimes do things I know I should not be doing? How can I become a bit more humble? Why is something such a struggle for me? What am I to make of the unchangeable fact that as a human being, I am flawed? Now, obviously, this is a very limited range of questions and ideas, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a glimpse that even though we talk about the Tanya being a user manual for the soul, which can sound like something perhaps very deep and maybe a bit abstract that we don't relate to, as we start the series and we delve into the ideas, I think you will really find that the Tanya addresses very real life dilemmas, struggles, questions, situations that we all deal with inside ourselves on a very frequent basis. And it goes to the core of everything in order to give us a different perspective and in order to empower us to approach these difficulties and these issues from a place of strength, from a place of being on top, instead of being overwhelmed and burdened by it. So I hope that this class has given you a good introduction, a good prelude to sort of set the background of where this all comes from. And I look forward in the coming weeks to go on this journey together with you. It's a journey that you can take numerous times and each time go deeper and deeper and see how it, although it's a work that was written a few hundred years back, it has relevance today in ways that can be actually very startling. So thank you for joining me